Hey pals, how are we doing? I just wanted to try and do something a little bit different going into this term, try and make this a little bit more personal, especially if we're going to kind of be doing this for most of the term and maybe even a little bit into September. So just trying this out, try and deliver the lessons as if we were in class, okay? So we'll see how it goes, see if you like it. So the first thing I want you to do is to send me over the homework across the half term. So that was the little portfolio scrapbooky thing you were kind of preparing, just a little one on German Expressionism, things you found out about it, landmark examples of German Expressionism, etc, etc. So if you want to press pause now and then email me over, if you haven't already done so, because I know a few of you have, just email me over the homework and then we'll go from there. So press pause now and take 5 minutes and get that done. If you've already done it, press pause, take 5 minutes, have a great time. See you in 5. Nice one, lads. Thank you for that. Okay. I'm going to have a look through those and see what you've been up to, see kind of where you're at in terms of your relationship to German Expressionism. And I want to go now just introduce this whole area, okay? So you should have open now the PowerPoint, the instructions are in the email. So you've gone to OneDrive, you've gone to Component 2, you've gone to Silent Film, and there's a PowerPoint in there called Silent Cinema and German Expressionism. And basically we're going to go through that for the majority of this week, just step by step, layer up our knowledge about silent cinema and German Expressionism. I'm going to start with silent cinema. Okay, so if you could just switch to, I've got the PowerPoint in front of me here, technology. So if you want to just go to PowerPoint slide 2, okay, and you'll see a big question there, and it says, what silent films have you seen? Okay, it's a simple question. So again, I'd like you to kind of pause this video, and I want you to take 5 minutes, and I want you to write down as many silent films you can think of that you've actually seen with your own 2 eyes, okay? And then we'll crack on from there. So as many silent films that you've seen. You might not have seen any, and that's absolutely fine, no problem at all. You might have seen a few, okay? Whatever it may be, write them down. I'll see you back here in 5. Nice one. Okay, so you should have a list. Maybe it's got nothing on it. Absolutely fine. Maybe it's a few things. Okay. If you just switch to PowerPoint 3 for me. So slide 3 on the PowerPoint. I'm going to do the same now as well. Here. Go to PowerPoint 3. Just apologise for a second because I'm having, you might hear like different noises and crazy sounds. I'm having my entire roof replaced. There's a skip next door. There is trees being chopped down at the back over there. There's literally builders walking past my window here, looking at me, okay? So the kind of gender disparity couldn't be greater, okay? Outside there, men, muscly men, okay, working manual kind of jobs, really, I mean, doing the good work, you know? And I'm in here, filming myself on my phone, talking to you about German Expressionism, Fritz Lang, Murnau, the Weimar Republic, the silent films of Buster Keaton and Chaplin. And I think we know who's the real man. I think we know. I'm busting down gender stereotypes, one trope at a time. Anyway, so if you just switch to slide 3, okay, you'll see a number of different images, okay, and films. I'm just going to talk you through some of them. I want you to write them down as we go through the titles and seek them out. Seek them out. Go and watch them because silent cinema is incredible, as you will hopefully come to learn. And this is a big topic for us, and it's hard sometimes, silent cinema, because there's a barrier up because we're so used to sound. But many film academics, critics, thinkers really do consider the silent era perhaps as the greatest era in all of cinema. And I hope you get even just a little sense of that as we go through it. So slide 3, okay? Top left of the screen, you'll see an image from Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. His masterpiece, or one of his masterpieces. He made many, but Modern Times is often considered his masterpiece. It's just a wonderful film. He was capable, Chaplin, of great comedy, great slapstick, but also these kind of massive reserves, wells of emotion that he managed to always do that without being too sentimental. He managed to get it, I think anyway, just right. Such warmth and love in his characters, but also incredibly funny at the same time, certainly as his work carried on as well. And Modern Times is maybe the perfect example of that. Next to Chaplin there on the top row, we have, of course, Buster Keaton, who is my personal favourite of all the silent comedians. I think he's got maybe the greatest face in the entire of cinema. And that's his film, The General. The General is considered one of the best films ever made. Orson Welles, director of Citizen Kane, Touch of Evil, we know Orson Welles, considered it the greatest film he'd ever seen, The General. I think it's on Amazon Prime, I think. I'm certain it's on the BFI player, but really do get hold of that. It's about 80 minutes long. It's one of his later full-length films. Obviously he made lots of shorts. Actually at the moment, this is in front of my TV at the moment, okay? Which is a collection of his work that me and my daughter, who is 5, have been going through, and she's just, genuinely laughing her head off. And she's not been trained to be some pretentious kind of film student at 5 years old, although I bet many of you are thinking that. She loves it. It's just funny. It's just funny. His face is funny. His body is funny. The things he can do physically are just incredible, and it's just wonderful to watch, just pure joy. So watch some Buster Keaton. Next to that we can see Pandora's Box, okay, starring Louise Brooks, who was one of the first real movie stars. So a real movie star, Louise Brooks. And as we go through the course, you'll see little connections to Louise Brooks in the second year. Certainly things like Vivre sa vie, where Jean-Luc Godard makes Anna Karina look like Louise Brooks with that kind of very distinctive black-haired bob. Jonathan Glazer plays around with the Louise Brooks look in Under the Skin as well as we go into the second year. And just look at that picture there. So it's the third along on the top row, and think about Uma Thurman in Pulp Fiction. It's an iconic look, and she was one of the first movie stars and a wonderful actress also. Second row on the left, the crazy guy with the robot, the female robot in the background, that's Metropolis, Fritz Lang's Metropolis, one of the greatest films ever made, a kind of Art Deco, kind of Baroque masterpiece with these incredible sets, and maybe even quite relevant at the moment. It's about workers kind of uniting and an uprising of workers to overthrow their capitalist overlords. So kind of, relevant 100 years on from when it was made. Next in the middle there is a film by Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel called Un Chien Andalou. And I don't want to say too much about that because I'm going to talk about that later in the lesson, but it's a landmark piece of cinema. Next to that famous iconic image of the woman with her glasses smashed and the blood running down her face from Battleship Potemkin. And then on the row underneath there, we've got Nosferatu, the famous shadow image of Nosferatu, the vampire kind of creeping up the stairs, which is a landmark image in cinema and German Expressionism particularly, okay? We have there, just look at that image there in the middle on the bottom row, okay? From Man with a Movie Camera, a piece of Russian silent cinema. It's kind of a documentary, but also a highly expressionist and strange and abstract documentary, kind of like intellectual montage. It's again the birth of intellectual montage. If you remember, we talked about that right at the beginning of the year. The idea of montage that isn't just about Hollywood cheating time and condensing time and showing the lovers kind of over 6 months getting to love each other or whatever, or Rocky training suddenly he's a machine. It's not that type of montage. It's the intellectual montage of early Russian cinema, where you would put together seemingly disparate or random images, but actually you had to then work to piece those together. It was like an equation, and you would have a revelatory moment when you figured out, oh, that is linked to that image, and if we put them together it means this, which is a wonderful thing. And Man with a Movie Camera is an amazing example of that. And if you look at that image of the filmmaker filming us, and then in the viewfinder we see the filmmaker again, and then in that viewfinder, and it goes on and on and on. It's about the layers of artifice and artificiality in cinema, which is just incredible. And then Birth of a Nation is the last film there. Now, Birth of a Nation is a very famous film by D.W. Griffith, but it's very controversial. So it's a film that many people think kind of brought on the many of the traditions and conventions of cinema. Like, it gave birth to the way that cinema is edited together, continuity editing, shot reverse shots, all of these established techniques Griffith did. It's a landmark piece of cinema in terms of the way it was put together as a feature film and a narrative. However, the narrative itself is fairly ropey in the sense that the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan are the heroes of the piece. So it doesn't go down too well now, of course, because that's disgraceful, and I'm sure it was at the time, but things were very, very different then, and D.W. Griffith could get away with such horrifying ideology. But the film itself, as a technical accomplishment, is often considered to be the birth of kind of like established narrative cinema that we have now. Okay, so there's those films. Seek them out, watch them all, and just wallow in a wonderful world of silent cinema, which is just fantastic, and get up to speed on it. It's a whole different language, and it's pure, it's beautiful. Okay, so let's move on. A question that I've got for you now, and I want you to take kind of 5 minutes to go and do this, is what films have we watched so far that contain extended silent sequences? So we've done loads of films already. We've looked at loads of films already that actually contain very extended silent sequences, where essentially you're looking at silent cinema. So can you think of what they were and just note them down? What films have we watched already that contain extended periods of silent cinema? Okay, just to prove to yourself that you've already watched this kind of stuff and you've enjoyed it and you've loved it. Okay, so 5 minutes. What films have we seen so far on the course that have extended periods of silent filmmaking? Back here in 5 minutes and we'll get some feedback. Cheers, lads. Hey guys, so we are on PowerPoint slide 4, okay? And the question I asked were what films we've watched that have contained kind of extended silent sequences, just to show that we've already kind of done this. We've already looked at essentially silent cinema, and the reason that these sequences were silent is because they're influenced by this period in cinematic history, and often cinema is one of the only mediums that can communicate with silence and just pure imagery. And it's certainly what Hitchcock was talking about when he talked about pure cinema. So let's go through some. As you can see on the slide, there's a few there. A couple that you haven't seen at the end that we do in the second year, so I won't talk about those. But Pan's Labyrinth, the Pale Man sequence is entirely silent. It's a 5-minute silent film sequence. It's a horror sequence. It owes so much to Nosferatu. I mean, if you think about Nosferatu as this kind of like pale, kind of like strange, monstrous figure who's kind of creeping up on a innocent female victim, that's the Pale Man sequence, even to the way that the hands are used and all that kind of stuff. So the Pale Man sequence is incredibly indebted to Nosferatu. You've also got the end, the chase through the labyrinth between Vidal and Ophelia is almost entirely silent, and every emotion is being communicated to us through pure cinema, through images, through music, yes, but mainly through images. And no dialogue is needed, okay? So they're two extended and significant silent sequences in the first film we ever watched, Pan's Labyrinth, okay? Vertigo, of course, contains two extended silent sequences. The Two follows around San Francisco, just absolute silent cinema. And remember that a lot of people have talked about the idea that Hitchcock, who came from silent cinema, that his early work was silent, and then he made the transition into talking pictures, when everybody else did, reluctantly, okay, and soon embraced that. But a lot of people think he remained a silent filmmaker at heart. He was most comfortable communicating only visually, and the follow around San Francisco sequences are just absolutely beautiful examples of that. Just no words at all, just pure visual communication. And they're not only communicating just what's going on, Scotty is following Madeline, they're communicating something deep and profound and emotionally complex if you take it apart, as we did, okay? Think about sequences from Psycho for Hitchcock as well. Psycho contains an extended, maybe like 15-minute silent sequence. The shower sequence is silent, and then Norman's discovery of the body, his tidying up of the body. He places the body into the boot of the car, he drives the car to the swamp, and he sinks the car in the swamp, and then he returns to the motel. Not single, well, one line of dialogue is spoken, that's it. It's a silent film. He becomes a silent filmmaker again, Hitchcock, in those moments, as he does in Vertigo. So we've got those in Vertigo. Apocalypse Now, its final sequence, the parallel editing between the bull, sacrifice of the bull, and the killing of Kurtz at the hands of Willard. Again, what's that? 10, 11 minutes, silent cinema. Everything being communicated silently without dialogue. So essentially a silent film at that point as well, okay? No Country for Old Men is like 10 different silent sequences where nothing is communicated. It's minimal. When there is dialogue in No Country for Old Men, it's quite dense, but when there isn't, it's sparse. There is nothing, and that's mimicked with the use of the soundtrack as well. So we've seen films that contain extended silent sequences already, so we don't need to worry about that. Okay. Okay. So let's move on. Okay, and let's move on to slide 5. Okay, and on slide 5, you'll see there a couple of quotes that I just wanted to put up to get you into the mode of thinking about silent cinema. So the top one is from our boy, Alfie Hitchcock, Hitch, the Hitchmeister. I nearly came up with another nickname then, which would have been wildly inappropriate, so I'm glad that I didn't. So Alfred Hitchcock, he says, the silent pictures were the purest form of cinema. Okay, and he really believed that. We've seen that. We just talked about that with Vertigo, Psycho, the purest form of communication, silent film. That's what Hitchcock thought. And then Charlie Chaplin, the silent picture, first of all, is a universal means of expression. And there's something so profoundly beautiful in that idea that silent cinema transcends every boundary really that you can think of. Certainly in terms of geography, certainly in terms of ethnicity, certainly in terms of like where you are from, the entire world. It's a global, universal experience, silent cinema. You don't need to share a language, a spoken language, to be able to sit in a room together and enjoy silent film. And that is a profoundly wonderful thing when you stop and think about it. I just wanted to put those two up there because I think they're really important. Charlie Chaplin was so upset with the introduction of sound, so upset by it. And he was in many ways right. It did set cinema back. The 30s were not a great vintage decade for cinema. Up until the 20s, we get really Sunrise in 1927 is maybe the crowning achievement of silent cinema. There are others, of course, like Metropolis and a lot of the others that we've just mentioned, but Sunrise is right up there. And I think in terms of when it happens, 1927, the same year that sound is introduced in cinema. So it's kind of the last gasp of silent cinema, Sunrise, and maybe its greatest achievement. And then cinema, many believe, me included, just takes a step backwards in terms of its creativity, in terms of what it can do, in terms of how it pushes. It just stagnates a little bit because people became so reliant on just talking pictures, just kind of like filming scripts or filming plays with actors in a wide shot and then a mid shot and then a close-up and a close-up, and then you talk, next scene. And it lost its essence, visual communication, okay? So Chaplin was right about that, and it took cinema about a decade or so to recover, and then it starts to really get going again. Certainly in 1941, when Orson Welles emerges with Citizen Kane. So I just think those quotes are really interesting to look at. So make sure you've written those quotes down. Okay. So that was slide 5, I think. Okay. So slide 6 and 7 now, I'm just going to talk through. Okay. And I want you to go through it with me on the PowerPoint. Make the notes. If you need to pause, you can do, of course. Take your time, do it at your own pace. But I'm going to talk through them like we would do in class. Try and replicate the lesson experience as much as we possibly can. Okay. So PowerPoint slide 6, the silent era. Let's talk through this. Let's give it a little bit of context, and then I'm going to leave you with a task. Okay. So silent era. So PowerPoint slide 6, the silent era. Let's talk through it. Let me introduce it to you, give you some context over the next couple of slides, okay? So I'll go through it with you and you click down as we go. So the first thing to say is that the silent era is probably one of the most fertile, one of the most creative periods in the entire of human history. I know that sounds like a kind of massively overblown statement, but it isn't. The world changed across the silent era. As you'll see when we get to next lesson, the birth of modernism as a broader kind of social, cultural, political movement ties directly into silent cinema. And cinema was at the forefront of these changes. And cinema just evolved in leaps and bounds at this point, at astonishing rates. So genuinely one of the most creative periods of human history. Across the 30 years that you would kind of say was the silent era of film, so from about 1895, the birth of cinema, to about 1927, the end of silent cinema, sunrise, and then we get the first talking picture, The Jazz Singer, in 1927, so the same year. So you've got, this 20-year period or so, this 30-year period or so, where an entirely new visual medium and vocabulary was introduced. It's incredible. Cinema didn't exist. So the whole medium, the whole art form didn't exist. And then it did. I can't even think about a comparative point anymore because it seems like everything's there now, but there was no cinema and then there was. It was an entirely new art form. And then within a 30-year period, that art form developed its own language, its own vocabulary, its own means of expression and communication, which is what we've been studying this entire year. How do you communicate using cinema? Well, in this 30-year period, that's when all of this was invented. All of it was invented, which is very exciting and wonderful, right? Many filmmakers, many critics, as I've already mentioned earlier on, really do consider the films of the silent era to be amongst the greatest ever made, if not the greatest ever made. And really you should go and listen to Scorsese on this. If you can, the BFI player is £5 a month, but you get a 14-day free trial. Okay, and there's like 550 films on there, which is incredible. Some wonderful cinema, including some Buster Keaton, including some Chaplin, I think maybe, Ozu, and loads of different things. But they have on there, I think, Martin Scorsese's personal journey through American cinema, which is one of the greatest series ever made. It's Scorsese talking about cinema from the beginning up until that point, the cinema that influenced him. The American cinema specifically that influenced him. He talks a lot about silent cinema there, and I mean, just do it. It's just wonderful. There's like 7 or 8 episodes of it, full of clips and moments from cinema. You will know incredibly. You will know so much more about cinema by the time you get to the end of it, and there'll be so much for you to want to go out and discover. So do that if you can. And Scorsese is obviously one of those people who really does believe that silent cinema, the films from the silent era, are amongst the greatest ever made. Okay. I think this is because film is seen as a visual medium. It is primarily a visual medium. When we slip it, there are films that benefit massively from talking and from dialogue. Okay. But that's not what cinema is at its core. At its core, it's a visual medium. So silent cinema serves it best. And as that final point there on slide 6 says, the introduction of sound in 1927, it was The Jazz Singer, and the first words in cinema were, "You ain't heard nothing yet." Al Jolson, the popular American entertainer, he was in the film at the time, and he says, "You ain't heard nothing yet." And that was the first dialogue, the first line of dialogue in all the film. Okay, And we then had that period that I was talking about before, an age that relied on, about a decade or so, that really relied on dialogue. And it was essentially filmed plays, wide shot, mid shot, close up, end of scene. And some of those worked, All About Eve, just off the top of my head, for an example, just a wonderful filmed play, a sensational movie. But most of them didn't. Most of them were quite boring, okay? And it took a decade or so for cinema to kind of be able to bring the two together. Yes, we can use clever and brilliant dialogue, but we can also combine that with still communicating purely from a visual sense, and cinema found its feet again. So let's move on to slide 7, if you would. So what I want to do here, this is the last slide we're going to go through today in this session. What I want to do here is talk a little bit about why I think you should get rid of any barriers that you might have to silent film, okay? First point, silent films aren't silent. They're full of sound effects, and they're full of music, and they're full of of sound, okay? There's just no dialogue, that's it. So it's not like you're sat there in absolute complete silence. There's a soundtrack. Now obviously in the old days when they were screened at the cinema, there would be some guy in the corner just rattling on the keys, or they would often have the film camera had a kind of like a record player attached to it, and you would send out the sound effects and the music, and then you'd have to the projectionist would have to line up the reels of film and put on the record and line it up at the same time so that it wasn't kind of out of sync. Incredible. I've seen one of those machines. I don't know if anybody is from Stockport represent, but just in Stockport in the Plaza, which is a beautiful Art Deco building that sometimes shows films. If you ever get a chance, go to there to watch something. They've got one of those old machines. They don't use it anymore, but I went and had a little tour because I am a nerd, and it was awesome to see just where you would put the record, where the reel would go in, and they've got reels of stuff in there as well, old Laurel and Hardy movies and stuff that they show sometimes. Just magnificent. So silent films aren't silent. Their lack of dialogue is not a weakness, and I don't want you to think of it as a weakness. It is a strength, because they're not relying on just saying things, exposition. It's not like Inception. Ellen Page walking around in the background all the time going, so what you're saying is in dreams, and it's just like reams of exposition. That's not what this is. It's pure visual communication. They had to be clever. They had to think as artists, how do we communicate visually? So the lack of dialogue is not a weakness, it is a strength of these films. I want you to see it that way as well. And like that third point there on the PowerPoint on slide 7 says, maybe not being spoon-fed expositional dialogue all the time, So my brother says, oh, that's your brother, so blah, 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 and explaining. So we're always aware of everything. Maybe not being spoon-fed that type of expositional dialogue all the time, it actually opens us up to be more active spectators. We have to think, we have to engage, we have to put 2 and 2 together ourselves visually, and suddenly we're in the film in a way that sometimes you can just sit back as characters explain things to each other in expositional scenes of dialogue, and you disengage and you become passive because you're just being spoon-fed stuff. Instead, silent cinema encourages us to be active, or more active, you could argue, and I think that's a really important way to think about this silent cinema as well. We have to work out the detail for ourselves. We have to negotiate the experience. It becomes more of a conversation between the director and the audience, rather than the director just going, here's a chunk of information, here's who this character is, this is what this character is feeling, you know it because they are saying it. No, there's none of that. We have to read facial expression and emotion and dig a little deeper with silent cinema, okay? Murnau, F.W. Murnau, who directed Sunrise, who we're going to study in more detail, obviously, wanted to push as far as he could go to be purely visual. I mean, he didn't even want titles, like in silent cinema, a title card would come up. Incidentally, One of my favourite title cards of all time is in a Buster Keaton short where the whole film is a dream. We don't realise that till the end. It's a wonderful cutaway to him asleep in a cinema, and he's imagined the whole thing while he's been watching this film, which is just wonderful. So spoiler alert, should have put the spoiler alert before that, but anyway, it's neither here nor there. So in the dream that he's having, he's some kind of like hyper masculine cowboy figure, and he comes home and he appears to have caught his wife in a romantic situation with another man, and he immediately, as a gunslinger, he takes his guns out and he shoots them both, and then he goes over and he looks, and then he just looks up at the camera like this, and then it cuts to the title card and it just says, "I have made a mistake. That is not my wife, and I do not live here." It's just really funny. It's just a very dry title card, and just it makes me laugh whenever I think about it. So Murnau didn't even want title cards. He wanted to get rid of that, just pure visual communication, a universal medium where we were co-storytellers, where the audience and the director work together to make the story, which is a beautiful idea. Okay. So I hope that's kind of brought you up to speed a little bit on the silent era. What I want to do, if you just go to slide 8, there's 3 sequences here that I want you to just now have a look at. I just want you to have a look at, okay? The first one's from The Passion of Joan of Arc by Carl Dreyer, a very famous silent film. We'll talk about it a little more in the second year because it plays a role in Vivre sa vie, Jean-Luc Godard's film. You probably recognise images from it. It's just an incredibly moving and beautiful film, and this is a famous sequence from it. It's just a couple of minutes, so have a look at that. Maybe go and seek that out. It's just absolutely sensational cinema. Then there's a little video essay on Buster Keaton, okay, called The Art of the Gag, and that's about 8 minutes, and it should give you an overview of what Buster Keaton did and how he communicated visually, certainly his gags, his jokes, which is what he was aiming to do all the time. And you'll just see what an absolute genius Buster Keaton is. And then the final one, pushing the boat out a little bit, is called Un Chien Andalou. Un Chien Andalou, which we mentioned before, you might have seen the image. We've got the image up in class as well, in the classroom. It's the image of a woman and a man's hand is opening her eye like this, and then there's a razor blade here. And that's the famous image from Un Chien Andalou. And it was co-directed by Salvador Dali, the surrealist artist, and Louis Buñuel, the film director. It's 20 minutes long, it's a silent piece of cinema, but it's entirely surreal, entirely abstract, extremely challenging. The first minute or so, which is the eye sequence, fairly explicit and grim. So if that's not for you, maybe ironically close your eyes or skip through that bit. It's an incredible film, like nothing you've ever seen. One of those kind of, I think my life has changed kind of films. If you dig it, if you don't, you'll be like, why have I been made to watch this? But that's the point, so watch it. Can you imagine watching a film from the 20s that's still as challenging and strange and weird 100 years later? That's how ahead of its time it was. It's still controversial, still strange 100 years after it was made. Incredible achievement. So watch that. And then next lesson I'm going to be asking you to write a little bit about Un Chien Andalou specifically. So watch those, make some notes, have a good time, and I'll see you next lesson. I hope this has worked. Bye!